the Second World War. Now, we left off looking at the League of Nations and the limitations of the League of Nations for the First World War. And we're going to be going into now how the Second World War really started, what caused it, and what really started it, really, and then go through the cause, well, the course rather, and then the effects of the Second World War, right? So the world before the war. Let's look at the pretext, right? The pre Second World War world, a precarious balance and rising tensions, right? In the years leading up to the Second World War, the global landscape was marked by fragile balances of power, right? We know that there were fragile balances of power as new nation states were created, old nations fell, right? Old empires fell, right? So there's no rebalancing of power happening, and it's really fragile at this moment. We have simmering tensions because of the new demarcated lines, right? As well as the fact that the colonies themselves are kind of upset, right, by being brought into a global conflict, right? And we have unresolved grievances stemming from the aftermath of the First World War. So the Treaty of Versailles, while intended to bring an end to all hostilities, left many issues unresolved and sow seeds for future conflict. You have economic instability exacerbated by the Great Depression of the 1930s, further destabilizing international relations, leading to the rise of aggressive and expansionist regimes. Right? So let's have a look at this. What's happening in East Asia? Japan's invasion of Manchuria was an implicit, right, a very important challenge, right, to international order. In 1931, Japan seized the Chinese region of Manchuria, citing alleged provocations of Chinese forces. Right, there was a bridge accident, and they just assigned it to China. China was the issue, right? Therefore, this aggressive act violated both international law and principles of the League of Nations, which called for peace resolutions and disputes and respect for national sovereignty. So, looking at here, right, specifically, all the blue parties were Japan controlled, so they captured Taiwan and captured Greater Manchuria and took Peking, which was the old capital, right? Right. At this moment, though, what was basically happening in Manchuria or in China was basically the fact that the Chinese emperor, right, ruled under the regime of Chiang Kai-shek, right, was being completely destroyed, right, by the Japanese forces. And then we have new regimes rising up, right, within China with Mao Zedong. But you guys don't look at that at history too. But we're not going to go in depth into it. But we know that a dispute, right, must be actually settled with the League of Nations. So we're trying to use the League of Nations now. This is the first real challenge in the League of Nations. So dispute combinations from the League of Nations and call for Japan to withdraw its forces, right? So we have that thing now. So the League of Nations calls for Japan to withdraw its forces from China, right? The Japanese government refused to comply and ultimately withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933. The Japanese delegation came in, told the League of Nations that they cannot accept, right, their terms, and then the Japanese delegation walked out of the League of Nations. That was the first sign of the incompatibility with the League of Nations and the modern conflicts, right? The fact that the League of Nations was not enough, right, to resolve these conflicts. So the Japanese invasion of Manchuria eventually spread to the Philippines, eventually spread to the Netherlands and to, well, the technically when I call it it's not the Netherlands and it's the East Indies, right? It eventually spread to nowadays Indonesia, right? Japan at the advent of the World War, right, started with Manchuria, and by the end of the Second World War, actually almost controlled around like half of Asia. And we're gonna be looking at that. Then we have the Ethiopian conflict, another test the league's resolved. In Italy, under the leadership of Benito Mussolini of Italy, right, launched a full-scale invasion into Ethiopia, seeking to expand his colonial empire. So at this time, Italy controlled colonial Somalia, right? Somalia was under Italian control, and he wanted to expand into East Africa, right? So the League of Nations was tasked to uphold the principles of collective security and prevent aggression, right? So what basically happened at the in the middle of the war, or while the war was going on, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia traveled to the League of Nations, right, to vouch for a type of resolution by the League of Nations, and he was not answered, right? He was not answered. The answer they gave him was not enough. He was basically not answered. He was shrugged off, right? So Emperor Haile Selassie had to go into exile, right, because of this conflict, right? So what was basically happening here? The League of Nations was tasked with upholding the principles, right, condemning Italy's actions and impose economic sanctions in an attempt to coerce Mussolini into withdrawing his forces. All right, they tried something to defend Ethiopia. However, these measures proved ineffective in deterring Italian aggression, as the League members, including Britain and France, were reluctant to enforce sanctions that might jeopardize their own interests. So another nation in East Africa was on that. The emperor himself came to the League of Nations to address it, and Britain and France did nothing. Right? Nothing, because it may jeopardize their own interests. Right? So a lesson learned, right, from this League of Nations. The League of Nations, right, the failures of League of Nations effectively addressed Ethiopian conflict and Japan's invasion of Manchuria underscored the organization's inability to prevent aggression, right? So what was basically happening here now? In the face of militarism and nationalism, the League of Nations proved ineffective. So that basically caused other nations looking on to say that, hey, this league is not going to do anything, is it? Right? That means that I can breach international law and nothing comes from it. Right? So the absence of leadership and the absence of any type of success of the League of Nations, right, actually helped in creating different issues across the world. As nations and authoritarian regimes realized that the League of Nations was completely ineffective. So its legacy here now of the League of Nations, right, serves as a reminder of the ongoing challenges to maintain peace and stability in the world, fraught with competing interests and ideologies, right? So the League itself was ineffective, and we're going to look at how the League is ineffective within Europe as well, right? So the Euro-German situation. Let's have a look at the Euro-German situation. So the Great Depression and the economic and catastrophe and social turmoil, right? So we know that the Great Depression would have swept through the 1930s, right, sweeping through Europe, plunging the continent into a period of unprecedented hardship and social upheaval, right? The depression was so deadly, right, that many persons were starving. Thousands of workers were put off, right, and they had to find different types of substitutes to even live, right. The collapse of the global markets triggered by the Wall Street crash of 1929 in the United States led to widespread unemployment, poverty, and economic instability across Europe. Industries grinded to a halt, right, or ground to a halt. Banks failed and governments struggled with basic services to support their citizens. This is complete and utter destruction of the economic system, right? What happened now? Germany's post-war trauma now, right? Let's look at it. What happened with Germany now, right? After that aftermath of the First World War, Germany found itself burdened with the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, right? So we know the terms of the we would look. You guys should have looked at the terms of the Treaty of Versailles when you came to this topic, right? So we look at the crippling reparation payments, territorial losses, military restrictions, those type of stuff, right? And when you couple the reparation payments I had to make, the 132 billion um gold marks that they had to pay, right, in their currency, right, coupled with the Great Depression, imagine what that did to the German economy. It shattered the economy per se and destroyed German pride. Hyperinflation and unemployment and political instability skyrocketed through the roof and plunged the Weimar Republic, right, into further resentment and disillusionment among the German populace. So the Weimar Republic would be the government or the democratic government in Germany at the time, and the citizens were angry at the government, right? This is something we see throughout history, right? Citizens always get angry at the government. In this case, they are furious with the Weimar Republic, right? So we have the rise of radicalism, exploiting grievances and promising redemption. So we have promises of redemption for Germany, right? As different groups tend to now rise up and out of the political turmoil, right? And actually gain charismatic leaders offering sympathetic solutions to the problems that Germany faces. Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, or what we call the Nazi Party, capitalized on Germany's sense of victimhood and promised to restore Germany to its rightful place at the center of the world. Right? So they promised the rejuvenation of the German people, the restoration of German pride, and that was one of the reasons why German people turned towards the NSDAP. Right? So we're looking at that. The appeal of fascism and authoritarianism and the cult of personality, right? Fascism with its emphasis on authoritarianism, right? Militarism and ultranationalism appealed to those disillusioned with the democratic government of the Weimar Republic and other democracies across Europe, right? So the democratic government of the hungry people, right? The hungry, the starving people, the humiliated people, right, will not be something to suffice. They all needed a strong leader, and they looked towards the charismatic leaders who were often fascist in this time. Hitler's cult of personality and his ability to mobilize mass support through propaganda and mass rallies solidified his grip on power, leading to the erosion of democratic institutions and the consolidation of Nazi rule. But we're going to look at how Hitler rose to power and how fascism sweeps across Europe after the Great Depression, right? So Hitler's rise to power, though, how did he become the Führer, right, or the leader of Germany, right? So you have political opportunism and manipulation, right? So he joined the German Workers' Party, the DAP, which later became the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, or the Nazi Party, in 1919, right? So he rose to prominence after that, after the First World War. Hitler quickly became known as from his charismatic oratory skills, right? So he was a great speech giver. He could deliver speeches like none other. He could convince a people like none other, right? A charismatic leader is an important proponent of our revolution, right? So particularly regarding the treaties of Versailles and economic hardships and of the Great Depression, right? He offered some amount of some relief from these things. So he preyed on the frustrations of the people. Well, not preyed, he appealed to the frustrations of the people, right, through these means, right, and offered a way out, right? We also have propaganda and mass appeal. So Hitler and his Nazi party employed sophisticated propaganda techniques, right? So he held Hitler's speeches, rallies, and new modern media such as radio and film helped to create a cult of personality around him, right? So the Nazis exploited nationalist sentiments, right? Scapegoated minority groups like the Jews and the communists, and promised to restore Germany to greatness, right? So we're looking at that. We're going to look at the Jewish question, right? And we have to also highlight the fact that communism was seen as the ultimate enemy to fascism, right? And we're going to look at how the treaty between Germany, right, and Russia in the First World War will be breached by Hitler, right? We also have other political mechanisms, right? In the early 1930s, we know that the Weimar Republic is, trying to address economic crises, right? Issues like that, right? While the Nazi Party surged, the Nazi Party offered a way out, because at the time the people were furious with Weimar Republic, so the Nazi Party was an alternative. So they resorted to the Nazi Party, right? In the 1932 elections, the Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag. The Reichstag speaks to the German parliament, right? So the Reichstag is parliament. They became the largest party in the Reichstag, in the parliament, right? Though they did not secure an outright majority, though, right? Through backroom deals and coalition politics, Hitler was appointed the Chancellor of Germany by President von Hindenburg, right, in January 30, 1933, right, and this marked the beginning of Hitler's consolidation of power. So he now had a leadership position to project his ideals and his Nazi ideologies onto the German people, right? Next, we have the Reichstag fire and enabling act, right? So what's happening here? The Reichstag is the parliamentary building, right? So the Reichstag fire in February of 1933, right? Following that, Hitler used the incident as a pretext to push through the Reichstag fire decree, right? And suspend civil liberties and allowed the arrest of political opponents, right? So what basically is happening here now, what is called the Reichstag fire decree is basically saying that, okay, the parliament building was burning down, right? So clearly there's so much political unrest in Germany that we have to like cancel everything, cancel all voting, cancel everything, right? We must deal with these issues immediately. So what he basically did is use this cleverly to capture his political opponents, right? In 1933, March 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, granting Hitler dictatorial rights, right, and power, and effectively ending democracy in Germany, right? So the legal framework placed Hitler swiftly eliminated rivals, right, within the government, right, and consolidated power in the hands of Nazi Party, right? So what's basically happening now? He scapegoated his opponents for actually creating the Reichstag fire, right? He became the sole Führer, the leader of Germany, via actual legitimate legal pathways, right? And from then, the Nazi Party became the predominant ruling party within Germany, right? So we have that there. So Hitler never, you know, did anything outright against politics, right, to get his power. He used it to his advantage, right? Then we have the death of President Hindenburg and Hitler's assumption of absolute power. Now the president is dead in August of 1934. It provided Hitler the opportunity to merge his roles as Chancellor and President, effectively making him the supreme leader of Germany. Right? Hitler consolidated all of his authority and assumed the title Führer. Right? So he became the Führer and the Chancellor. Right? The Reichskanzler, right, of Germany in August 1994, 1980. What am I talking? 1980, 1934, right? He became the Führer, the leader of Germany, right? So this marked the formal establishment of Hitler's totalitarian dictatorship and the beginning of the Nazi regime of terror in Germany, right? So let's look at how the regime looked. Let's look at how the regime worked within Germany. Now, honestly, before all the issues started to happen within Germany, Hitler was actually a leader who allowed Germany to bounce back from the Great Depression. He created large works projects, right? Large works projects that gave a lot of persons jobs, right? He decreased unemployment rates, right? Infrastructure creation and repair skyrocketed through the roof, and Germany recovered, honestly, stronger or better than almost all the economies in Europe. He was presented as one of the best leaders in Germany at the time, right? While other economies suffered, somehow Hitler was able to allow the German economy to bounce back rapidly. And other fascist governments bounced back rapidly as well. Because Benito Mussolini in Italy, right, allowed Italy to bounce back rapidly as well. So we could know that democratic societies across Europe were struggling to get out of the Great Depression, while fascist societies actually just jumped out immediately, right? So they rose out exponentially quicker than democratic societies. So Hitler was seen as a great leader at the time. He was seen as a leader, right, by all the world's people who would now restore the German people to their rightful place, right? So he wasn't seen as completely evil at the time. It was just a nationalist socialist party. It was just another political party. But let's look at what's happening. We are starting now to breach the Treaty of Versailles. He initiated a rapid rearmament program, the creation of the Luftwaffe, which is the Air Force. He started tank production. He started conscription, right? He started the reanimation of the U-boats or the submarine industry, right? He started to rearm, right, and to remilitarize Germany, breaching the Treaty of Versailles. What is the response to the breach of this treaty now? Britain and France expressed concern but took little action to enforce the treaty's provisions. They were preoccupied with domestic issues and hoped to avoid another war. So remember, Britain and France are still rebuilding, right? And they don't want to go for another conflict like the First World War. So they basically took concern of what was happening with the remilitarization of Germany, but really didn't do much. Right? Where the remilitarization of the Rhineland, as known by the Treaty of Versailles, it demilitarized the Rhineland, right, and ordered Germany not to remilitarize the Rhineland, right. But in 1936, Hitler ordered the remilitarization of the Rhineland, just destroying, right, the treaty basically, right. So he just breached the treaty again. The response of Britain and France issued diplomatic protests but did not take military action to enforce them. So what is Prime Minister Chamberlain doing? Right? Prime Minister Chamberlain, right, in Britain at the time, did not want another war for Britain to go into, right? Along with Daladier, who was the president of France. Right? Daladier and Chamberlain were generally just not looking for any type of conflict, because they were just rebuilding after the last war. They don't want any type of any major conflict to actually damage their countries again, right? So they yet again more or less ignored, right, the remilitarization of the Rhineland. Then we have the complete annexation of Austria that is known as the Anschluss. The Anschluss was not only violating the treaty, it did not only violate the Treaty of Germany by merging Austria with Germany, but also contravened the Treaty of Germain, right, which had explicitly prohibited such a union. So there was a treaty that prohibited the union of Austria and Germany, and there was also generally the Treaty of Versailles that actually restricted territorial expansion, but he basically breached both of them in the Anschluss. So we could believe at this time Hitler is looking on to Britain and France and seeing how far he could go with breaking these treaties while actually incurring no response from Britain and Germany. At this time now, British and French forces now expressed verbal condemnation of the Anschluss. They did not intervene militarily to stop it though. The policy of appeasement prevailed, so they tried to appease Germany to make sure that another conflict does not start. Right? By the way, the Anschluss was peaceful. The Austrian people let the German people in for the most part. They let them in and they merged as one united people. Right? Because the people of Austria were German as well. They spoke German, so they welcomed the Germans in. Right? Hitler's territorial ambitions just grew further, right? So the lack of response from Britain and France actually emboldened Hitler. So the Munich Agreement and the Sudeten crisis. What is happening here? This actually caused Prime Minister Chamberlain to actually come to Germany. So this is a picture of Prime Minister Chamberlain's visit to Germany to see what was happening. In 1938, Hitler demanded the annexation of the Sudetenland, a region in Czechoslovakia which has significant German populations. So he wanted to. It looks as if he wanted to rejoin the German people, right? He wants to reunify the German people. So he took Austria, who were German speakers, right? And he wants now the Sudetenlands, who were primarily German people as well. So the response of Britain and France now, eager to avoid war, engaged in diplomatic negotiations with Hitler and Mussolini at the Munich Conference. Alright? So the Munich Agreement allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenlands. So they allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenlands in exchange for Hitler's promise to never further territorial expansion. So they allowed him to annex the Sudetenland, to take the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, right? In exchange for a promise. That's so interesting, right? They just accepted the promise. Done. Promise. Okay, you have my word. That's it. Full stop. Right? So that was the Munich Agreement. right? So Britain and France believed that they had achieved peace for our time. Wow. They're accepting a promise. So let's look at this now. Along these issues that were happening in Germany, there was also the Jewish question, right? Well, Hitler was actually a radicalist in his younger days, right? And he was imprisoned, right, because of his radical movements and his attack and his civil disobedience, right? And in his time within his time in prison, he wrote his script Mein Kampf, right? Where it's actually a restricted book. I don't think it is available that much anymore, right? It was restricted after a certain while. I'm not sure if the restrictions have been lifted, but Mein Kampf and the Jewish question really it really showed how Hitler really thought, right, about the Jews, right, and his anti-Semitic views, right, in Germany. So Hitler expounded upon his anti-Semitic worldview, portraying views as an existential threat to the German people and civilization as a whole. Now remember, Hitler was a staunch Christian, right, and he was completely against, right, the Jewish people. He propagated a myth of the global Jewish conspiracy aimed at world domination and portrayed Jews as parasites, leeching off of the productive members of society. So Hitler advocated for the removal of Jews from positions of influence in society, particularly in realms of politics, finance, and culture. He called for the segregation of Jews from the rest of society and established a racially homogeneous German state free from Jewish influence. So this was his worldview. And that led to the Holocaust, right? And we know what the Holocaust would be. The implementation of the anti-Semitic policies now, right? So his regime enacted series of discriminatory policies, right? Known as the Nuremberg Laws in 1935, right? Where Jews were stripped of the German citizenship and prohibited the intermarriage, prohibited intermarriage with Jews and non-Jews, and restricted the rights of various aspects of them in public life, right? So we basically have this entire issue, right? So the anti-Semitic policies of the Nazi regime escalated over time, culminating in the systematic genocide of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. Under Hitler's orders, millions of Jews were rounded up, deported to concentration camps like Auschwitz, and murdered in gas chambers in one of the most horrific acts of genocide in human history. Right? Now, a sore topic here is whether or not this is as horrific as slavery, but we're not going to get into that right now. We're not going to get into that. I have really interesting views on that, but we're not going to get into that. Right? But it was a very horrific moment within human history to see a large group of people taken from their homes, carried to camps to die because of their religious views. Right? The Nuremberg laws now, we know about the Reich citizen law, which basically stripped their citizenship and prevented intermarriage, right, or intermingling, right. We know the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, right. So it forbade Jews from employing German women under the age of 45 in their households, aiming to prevent any type of racial contamination. He wanted a true Aryan race. Pale skin, blue eyes, blonde hair, a true Aryan race. That is what he wanted, right? So he not only targeted Jews, no, he targeted the LGBTQ, he targeted the blacks, he targeted the gypsies, he targeted any other cultural group which he seen as contaminating the German race, right? So he saw the German race as being the superior race, right? So we had that there. So the spread of ideologies now, we know that there's a spread of fascism within Europe at this time, alongside Hitler, with the rise of Mussolini within Italy, right, with his fascist party founded in 1919, orchestrated the March on Rome in 1992, demanding political power, right? So he orchestrated a march on Rome and took political power, creating a new fascist regime within Italy, right? Mussolini's entire idea was to seek to create a new Roman Empire through expansionist policies in Africa and the Mediterranean. So that was his entire view there through his fascist principles. Okay? And the rise of communism in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, right, led through chain reaction to the installment of Stalin as the leader of Russia. So the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia of 1917, led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, right, established the world's first communist state in Russia, right? So after Lenin's death in 1922, Joseph Stalin emerged as a leader of Soviet Russia, initiating a series of policies and consolidating power, transforming the country into the modern industrialized state. So it truly became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, right? At that time. So the breakdown of appeasement and the outbreak of the Second World War, Hitler's aggressive expansionism, continued unabated after the Munich Agreement, culminating in the occupation of the entirety of Czechoslovakia. So remember, through the Munich Act, right? Not the Munich Act, the Munich Agreement, right? They allowed Germany to get the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, but by 1939, Hitler invaded and took the entirety of Czechoslovakia. So Britain and France now realized the failure of their appeasement, right? And they pledged to defend Poland's sovereignty in the event of German invasion. Hitler invaded Poland on the 1st of September, right? And because of their pledge to defend Poland, Britain and France declared war on Germany, marking the beginning of the Second World War. So here's where the Second World War begins on the 1st of September 1939 with the invasion of Poland. Alright? So we have that there. So the course of the Second World War now, right? We're going to be looking at the major issues of the war and then culminating with the effects. Alright? So just to complete this and then head into past papers. So prelude to the war, the 1st of September 1939, Germany invades Poland, prompting Britain and France to declare war on Germany, marking the beginning of the Second World War. Blitzkrieg in Europe, right? We have Blitzkrieg in Europe. So Blitzkrieg is basically a type of military tactic, right? So using their Panzer Mark II tanks, that technology that Germany developed by German engineering is very profound, right? German forces swiftly conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France using Blitzkrieg tactics of rapid and coordinated attacks, right? So they conquered all of these nations using Blitzkrieg tactics after 1939, right? There was a Battle of Britain in the Mediterranean theater. So in 1940 to 1941, the Battle of Britain, right, sees the Royal Air Force repel German attacks, preventing the German invasion of Britain. In 1940, Italy ensures the war on the side of, enters rather the war on the side of Germany, launching campaigns in North Africa and the Mediterranean, right? German and Italian forces invade Yugoslavia and Greece, securing control over the entirety of the Balkans, right? So we're here seeing now the war spread through Europe, right? And it's important to note at the time, 1940 1941, at this time period, Winston Churchill would have been the new prime minister existing in Britain, would have created an entire coalition government in order to combat the Nazi scourge, right? So Winston Churchill would have been in control of Britain at this time, right? Then we have Operation Barbarossa on the Eastern Front, right? So in the 22nd of June 1941, Germany launches Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union, breaking the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? So in 1941 to 1942, initial German successes are met with staunch Soviet resistance, leading to brutal battles and staggering casualties on the Eastern Front. Over 8 million Russians died, right? And many more have been dying across Europe, right? Millions of persons are dying at this moment between the short span of a couple of years, right? Then we have the Pacific Theater of attack. So this is truly a global war now. On December 7th of 1941, Japan launches a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, bringing the United States into the Second World War. 1942, Japanese forces rapidly expand their control in the Pacific, conquering territories including the Philippines, Singapore, and Indonesia. Right? So before Pearl Harbor, right? But what's happening here? We have all of these issues happening within Europe. War broke out again, and nothing occurred until Pearl Harbor. What was happening in the US, right? Prior to the attack of Pearl Harbor, the United States had adopted a policy of neutrality. So after the First World War, they were pledging never to enter a war such like that ever again in order to defend the interests of its people, right? Right? So they provided material support to the Allied powers, particularly Britain and the Soviet Union, through programs such as Lend Lease, right? So they leased military equipment, but they never attacked. The attack on Pearl Harbor, however, galvanized public opinion in the United States, leading to the widespread sense of unity and resolve to confront the Axis powers, right? So we're not confronting the powers, right? So this attack on Pearl Harbor now actually led to the what would I call it now? The the breaking, right, of the policy of neutrality, right? So this is just a picture of the sinking of the USS Arizona, right, within the Pearl Harbor attacks, right? So they attacked early in the morning, right, in December. Well, not in December. Was it December? Yeah, December. I think I know my dates. I'm just a little bit, not as confident with the dates. So it was in December, right? So this was generally a trajectory of how the Pacific theater looked, right? Conquering Philippines and the Dutch East Indies and the new so part of New Guinea, right? So we have all of these islands are under Japanese control, and then the United States were sent in, no, to actually capture, right, the entire of Papua New Guinea, right, and some other islands, right? So heading into the Marshall Islands, going up to mainland Japan, right, and another force was traveling with Australian and British forces throughout Indonesia and into the Philippines, right, to combat the Japanese expansion, right? The turning point now. In 1942 to 1943, Allied victories at the Battle of Midway and at the Battle of Stalingrad and the Battle of El Alamein shift the momentum of the war. In 1943, the Allies launched successful campaigns in North Africa and Italy, leading to the downfall of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. So Mussolini falls in 1943, and then we have D-Day, right? The day that they will live on in infamy, right? The war on the Western Front becomes emboldened as US troops finally enter the war. June 6th, 1944, Allied forces land in Normandy, France on D-Day, launching the largest amphibious invasion in history and beginning the liberation of Western Europe from German occupation. In 1944 to 1945, Allied forces advanced through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, facing fierce German resistance, but ultimately pushing through towards Germany. Right? And then we have the defeat of Nazi Germany. In April of 1945, Soviet forces reached Berlin. So on the Eastern Front, Soviets are actually the first forces to reach Berlin. The Soviets fought, right, adamantly to defeat the Germans, right? So the Soviet forces reached Berlin, capturing the city after bitter street-to-street fighting. And in May 8th, 1945, Germany surrenders unconditionally, marking victory in Europe, right, or what we call VE Day, right, and the end of war in Europe, right? So we have that there, the Germany surrender to the Soviets, right, at the end of that there, right? But there was fighting in the Pacific, right? The Western Front was completely fine now with the victory in Europe, right? So let's look at the defeat of Nazi Germany. We can see, right, on the Western Front, right, we had Allied forces, right, coming up to defeat Germany there. But on the Eastern Front, all of that was Russia. So remember what I said about the First World War? Russia was literally probably the strongest nation on the planet at that moment. Russia itself, along with some Allied forces, British forces, right, were able to push, right, throughout all of Eastern Europe and enter Germany. And this was how really they defeated German forces through two different directions, right? Eventually, Denmark and Norway would be liberated as well. Okay? The Pacific Theater now and the defeat of Japan in 1945, Allied forces island hopped towards Japan. So they captured the Midway, they captured the Marshall Islands, they captured, well, they captured the Solomon Islands before those two. But the island hopped, right, through ruling battles such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa, right? And then August 6th, 1945, right, with the help of the Manhattan Projects and the scientists, right, involved in the Manhattan Projects, the first atomic bombs were created, right? And the first of them was dropped on Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945, right? Consider that was a considerable defeat to Japan. And to make sure that the Americans' enemies were seeing and could see the potential of the American military, they dropped the second one again in Japan on Nagasaki on the 9th of August 1945. Right? So in this case now, America is showing off to the world now that they, right, are the new superpower in this century, and they are here to stay. With their capacity and their power to drop two devastating atomic bombs, right, within the span of a couple of days, within the span of like 3 days, right? Showing now that the United States, right, is a power to be reckoned with. That is what they were trying to do here, right? It led to the destruction of large swaths of Japan and the killing of millions of Japanese citizens. Because what you did, you just dropped two atomic bombs on two cities, densely populated cities, right? But that's what's happening in Japan there. And then Japan surrenders on the 15th of August 1945. And that brings the Second World War to a close, right? So there we have victory, right, within Europe and victory within the Pacific. And now we have to look at the impacts of the Second World War, right? The war that changed the world. So the social impacts now, there was unprecedented loss of life with millions of military personnel, and upon millions more of citizens were killed and wounded. Many families experienced trauma of losing loved ones, leading to long-lasting psychological scars. Then we had the Holocaust and genocide. 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis forces, right? Along with other targeted groups, represented one of the darkest chapters in human history, right? So it goes, let me not say that, all right? Let me just say that, right? So basically, right, that human genocide, right, really promoted the movement towards combating genocide, to try to prevent genocides from happening in its modern age, right, and promoting human rights, right? The economic impact now, a war like this occurred again within the span of the same within the span of the same century. So there was, of course, devastation, right? Economic devastation and infrastructural obliteration, basically, right? So the process of rebuilding and reconstructing required massive investment of resources, right? And Europe once again calls on its colonies. Industrialization and technological advances now, the war stimulated industrial production. That's one thing I want to mention, right? War stimulates science and technological innovation influences war, right? So that's one thing there. So within the war, we found penicillin. Within the war, we found new aspects of aviation and new ways to communicate, right? Using things like the Enigma machine. Computers were a very integral part here as well, right? So computers were now created and moved, which were once military machines, are now used for general applications today, right? These developments laid the groundwork for the post-war economic growth and prosperity. And then with the political impact now, we now have the end of the colonial era, right? So the Second World War weakened completely the economies of Europe and accelerated decolonization in Asia and in Africa. Now, after the war, right, nations such as Thailand now move towards independence, right, and Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, right, and other leaders across the world, right, especially for leaders in India as well, move towards removing themselves from Europe. They have been dragged now into two global conflicts, right, which is to no fault of their own, and that actually accelerated the decolonization process, right? Colonized peoples, inspired by the principles of self determination and independence, sought to assert their rights and overthrow their colonial rules. Although we have neo-colonialism occurring primarily within Africa, but we're not going to look at that right now, right? The rise of superpowers now. The war hastened the decline of traditional European powers and the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers. The geopolitical landscape was reshaped by the Cold War rivalry, right? So now we have finished the World War era, right, and we entered into the Cold War era, right? Where now communism, right, after the end of Nazism, communism now becomes the ultimate enemy to the Western world and the quote unquote ultimate threat to democracy, right? So we have that after now, where the development of the FBI and the KGB and these different types of forces, right? The United Nations was also founded in 1945 in October of the year, right? In the aftermath of the Second World War. The signing of the United Nations Charter in San Francisco established the primary aim of promoting international cooperation, maintaining peace and security, and preventing future conflicts through collective democracy and multilateralism. Right? United Nations key principles are really to maintain the equity, sovereignty, and equality of international of member states, right? And uphold international relations and international laws, and to make sure that we have the promotion of human rights, right, and fundamental freedoms for all across the globe, right? So we know that we have specialized programs from the United Nations. We have the UNDP, we have all UNICEF, we have all these different programs in place so that the United Nations can assist developing nations as well as try to decelerate conflicts. So humanitarian crises and environmental degradation, making it making the United Nations crucial for those type of international cooperation, right? So they're fighting against any type of global challenges, armed conflicts, any type of crisis, any type of environmental degradation as well. And we're basically looking here at the pursuit for collective solutions to global problems with the United Nations, right? So we end here with the United Nations establishment on October 24th, 1945. And that's really what's happening there with the Second World War. Right? So it is a lot.